Over the summer, we've been doing a couple of things. We've been looking at the Beatitudes and the various hang-ups, and then with that, we've been looking at the various hang-ups that people have with Christianity. And we've been doing this for a variety of reasons, one of which is that we want to look at the objections the skeptics have and help those who are not yet Christians think through the claims of Christianity and help people far from Christ see the reasonableness of the faith. For younger believers, we want to give them solid footings and answers to the questions they may still be wrestling with. And then for mature believers, we want to help equip you to be able to more faithfully answer the objections of the skeptics and equip you to be more and more able as an evangelist. Now, this morning's hang-up is the question of science. And the question is, doesn't science disprove God? And this actually is, as many of the other objections that we've seen are, several questions compressed into one. It's the question of miracles. Can we believe that miracles happen? It's the question of tangibility. I can't touch it, so it must not be real. And it's the origins of life questions and the age of the universe questions, all rolled into one massive cultural objection. And people ask, does science and faith, can they go together, or do they clash? And the loudest voices in our culture say that they cannot go together, that they must clash. And skeptics have often argued that you can't believe in God while also using electricity and understanding how science works. They push and they say that we at one time believed that things were divine miracles and divine mysteries. But, science has gone through that, and they've shown how everything works and essentially invalidated the need for God and invalidated God. And we can explain everything through naturalistic mechanisms. And the conclusion that they draw is that science has buried God. That's the argument that you'll hear. That's the argument that will be made. Science has buried God. What do we say to that as Christians? Does science make God unnecessary? Can miracles really happen? Are science and faith at war? What do we say to that? My answer is science and faith are not at war, and science hasn't disproved God. In fact, science cannot lay a finger on him. It can't. It can't touch him. And when we start to look, we see this. Now, I want to just say, in terms of a word of humility, nothing I say today is going to be original. I am not a scientist. Libraries are filled up with responses to this hang-up, and realistically, just as I always do, I've gone and I've tried to mine for good answers and give you the best of what I have found. But having said that, I want to say that, again, science has not disproved God. It cannot lay a finger on him, and that it can't do so for 4 reasons. The first is that science is limited in what it can show us. The second is that this is God's word, and he invites us to study it. The third is that the whole argument rests on faulty assumptions, and beyond that, creation declares the glory of God. Now, right away, I want to dive into Psalm 19 and look at what we see there. When we look at Psalm 19, we see that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. It goes on to talk about how he has set the tent, a tent for the sun, and it talks about how there's nothing hidden from the sun, and it talks about just the glory of God that is visible in creation. And this is one of the most powerful declarations about natural revelation in all of Scripture. It's a piece of poetry that lays out that there are 2 books. The first book is nature. The second is special revelation. And so if you look on, you see that it turns the page starting in verse 7, and starts talking about the law of the law of the Lord being perfect, the law of the Lord reviving the soul, the law of the Lord being able to make you wise, the commandments of the Lord being pure and being more desired than fine gold. They warn us, and in keeping them is great reward. You know, when you look at this, what you see is that the heavens declare the glory of God. They positively shout it. You know, if you open up your eyes, you can see that we are not here by luck and chance. The skies declare his handiwork. You look out at the sunset and you know that this is not an accident. Many years ago, when I was still in seminary, I had a friend who was not an atheist, but he was not a Christian. And one day I was helping him put together a deck. And he knew I was in seminary, and we started just talking through stuff. And he said at one point that he knows it didn't just happen. And so I nudged him, because what do you say to that when an opportunity is like that is opened up? And we ended up having a great conversation. But here's the thing. Here's somebody who's not a Christian, who's a skeptic, who in a moment of unvarnished, real conversation says, look, I'm not a Christian, but I can't help but look and know that there's something. You know, you can't look at this and think that it just happened by luck and chance. And notice when you look at this, what you're seeing is that the heavens make that clear to us. Now, can nature tell us enough for salvation? Absolutely not. That's the whole point of the second half of the psalm. The law of the Lord needs to be given to you. Nature can tell you that there is a God, but it can't tell you how to come into relationship with that God. It can't tell you how he has worked to save us. But it can bring us to the point where we look up and say, there is more, and I need to know that God. And here's what's important to see here in relationship to the question in science. What we see here is that when we look, we can see that observation and study can get you only so far. And that's important, because at the end of the day, what is science? Science is a tool. Science is a method for observing information and creating hypotheses and measuring and testing and then drawing conclusions. And the scientific method starts when you ask a question about something in which you observe. You know, ask who, what, when, where, why. You know, the reality is your kids engage in science projects, you know, in rudimentary science when they have a project for the 5th grade science fair, and they do research trying to figure out how to get rockets into the air or make that lava explosion with baking soda and vinegar work. But here's the thing to see. Science is just a tool. And when you look at it, and you look at the world of observable data, what you're doing with science is you're saying, if I do this, then this and this will happen, and you make a hypothesis, and you say, if that's true, let's find out. And you run your test, and you come out on the other side, and you go, okay, so I got this progress, and this happened, and I didn't accomplish this, and now we've learned something. And so science is a tool for knowing. Now, here's the thing. While science is a tool for knowing, science can't tell you everything. And this is where we run into the conflict. Because science is a tool for observation and hypothesis and testing, and it's a great servant, but it's a terrible master. And this is where we run into the conflict. Because alongside of science, there's something else. There's science as a tool, and then there's scientific naturalism. You could summarize the creed of scientific naturalism in the words of Carl Sagan. The universe is all that there is, and all that there was, and all that there ever will be. There's the attitude that there is no God. Science and evolution have all the answers. And that leaves you in a rough place. There's no foundation for ethics, no meaning in life, no free will. But here's the thing to see. That claim is an article of faith. That claim is a faith statement. And we need to see that and understand it. Science as a tool is a way of knowing things. Scientific naturalism as a worldview is something entirely different. And science and the tool, science as a tool and faith are not in conflict. But scientific naturalism as a competing faith with Christianity, oh yeah, there's a conflict. There's a war there. And those two things stand in conflict with one another. The attitude that science and evolution have all the answers and God can be dismissed, and the attitude that says seas don't part and people don't rise from the dead and miracles are an illusion and matter is eternal, never mind that you can't prove that matter is eternal, those are in conflict. And we should not miss this. The idea that evolutionary biology has established all that there is around is an article of faith. And once you make that move, you've turned a tool for knowing into a worldview, a religion, a theology. And evolution becomes a stand-in for God and is treated as the key that opens every lock of life's mysteries. Because stop and think about what a religion does. A religion tells you who you are, where you're going, what's wrong with the world, why am I here, how do I get an identity that lasts, how do I find hope, how do I understand right and wrong and get a foundation for life that won't shatter when suffering comes. Scientific naturalism can't. It functions as a religion, but it can't give you a foundation that will keep you upright when times of hardship come. And so the bottom line is that there's no conflict between faith and science as a tool, but there is a conflict between faith and the worldview of scientific naturalism. And here's the thing to see once we start looking at that. Scientific naturalism has giant holes that we should not miss. The first one, first of all, this has been recognized by lots and lots of scientists. Francis Crick was a co-discoverer of the double helix structure of the DNA, and he said, "An honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us could state only that, in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have to be satisfied to get it going." Notice what Crick says as a scientist who's done high-level work. Almost a miracle. He's the guy that decoded the DNA. He's not a creationist. And he looks at his study and says, yeah, there's no way that this just happened. Along with that, Emma Bakes, who was a pioneering astrophysicist and astrochemist for NASA, she said, though scientists acknowledge the importance of nitrogenerated aromatics, they have no idea how they get the molecules for life. And look, you can keep going on and on. Scientist after scientist says, hey, we can study things, but we don't understand how it all got started. We're no closer to that than we were when we started this experimental process. Paul Davies, who's an acclaimed English physicist and cosmologist, says, as is well known, random molecular shuffling alone is exceedingly unlikely to make even a simple microbe from a planet covered in primordial soup within the age of the universe. Do you see what these people are saying? They're not close to knowing the exact process that produced life. They may never know. The evidence for this very primitive life has probably been destroyed by more effective life. And the holes, they say, they acknowledge as evolutionists are enormous. And when the holes get too big, they start to come up with ideas. One theory that's come up with is panspermia. Maybe life arrived from a meteor or comet. But here's the problem. Even if that concept were true, all you've done is just push back the question of where life came to back to somewhere else. The problem doesn't change, it just relocates. And so we're still stuck. And when you look at that, what you see is that they just have no idea. And when you start to think and you start to look, what you realize is they're nowhere. And that's before you start to get into the arguments. Stop and look at the press-back arguments. Science has no answer for the cosmological argument. Scientific naturalism has no answer for the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument says that whatever begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist. That's been shown by people like Edwin Hubble, who we named the Hubble telescope after. He demonstrated that light from distant galaxies showed that they're moving away from each other, which means that the universe is expanding, which means that there was a start. And that totally transformed the field of cosmology. Before, mainstream science said the universe was eternal, and then after Hubble, they understood, yeah, it had a beginning. there was a Big Bang, whatever that Big Bang was, and we Christians say the Big Bang came from God. God, in the beginning, God spoke, but there was a beginning. When you look at the second law of thermodynamics, that also, the fundamental principle from chemistry, which says that disorder is what happens over time. Disorder in the universe is always increasing, not decreasing. And that brings us back to the idea that there would be a God. If things are slowly going in the wrong direction, there's got to be a God. There's got to be a starting foundation who put things in order. The second law of thermodynamics states that disorder is always increasing over time, which means that when we look at things, we can see that there was a starting point. And if whatever begins to exist had a cause, and the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. The universe has a creator. There's characteristics of that cause. When we look, we would go, okay, so what's the characteristics of this cause? It would be immaterial, because the universe encompasses all material world. It's a cause that must be outside of matter. It must be dimensionless or infinite, because the universe includes all spatial dimensions. It's a cause that must be unbound by them. It must be timeless, because the universe includes all temporal dimensions. Einstein showed that space and time are components of the same substance, space-time. So this cause must be timeless and eternal. And it must be incomprehensibly powerful to have created all that we see. You don't need to be a theist to start to realize that this sounds like a comprehensive description of God, right? Francis Collins, he's the former head of the Human Genome Project, and he made some errors during the COVID years, but Collins made this observation. He said, the existence of the Big Bang begs the question of what came before that, and who or what was responsible. It certainly demonstrates the limits of science as no other phenomenon has done. The sense of awe created by these realizations has caused more than a few agnostic scientists to sound downright theological. Robert Jastrow wrote in God and the Astronomers, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He has conquered the highest peaks. And he pulls himself over the final rock. And he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. I particularly enjoy that. Science has no answer for the cosmological argument. It also has no answer for the teleological argument. If you look, the teleological argument is the argument for fine-tuning. The argument can be summarized in 6 words. The universe appears to be designed. And so stop and think about the evidence. Physicists have discovered that the universe is governed by universal physical constants, the speed of light, the gravitational pull, Planck's constants, and there's 15 of them total. And every single one falls within a very, very narrow range of life-permitting values, and even one of them was altered. If even one of them was altered in the slightest, the universe would not support life. Basically, we're balanced on a knife's edge as a universe. Paul Davies, he says, it seems as though someone has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. He says that the impression of design is overwhelming. Steven Weinberg, who's a Nobel laureate in physics, said, this is fine-tuning that seems to be extreme, far beyond what you could imagine just having to accept as a mere accident. William Lane Craig, who's an apologist, said the range of life-permitting values for the constants and quantities of the universe is extremely narrow. If the values of even one of these constants or qualities were to be altered by a hair's breadth, the delicate balance required for the existence of life would be upset, and the universe would be life-prohibiting. My favorite one of these comes from Fred Hoyle, who said the chance that higher life form might have emerged in this way is compared with the chance of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747 from the material therein. Stop and think about that picture. I think we have a few people in the room that work on highly complex machines. That's not going to happen. If you see a plane, you know that didn't happen by accident. You assume an amazing piece of engineering had an engineer. We have engineers down at EB working on submarines. We have people working on other machines around the area. They know these things don't just happen. The same logic applies to the world. When you look at the universe, you see each constant having fine-tuning, and you go, if something has been rigged, there must be a rigger. Somebody must have put it all together. Now, about here, someone pops up with the multiverse argument. The multiverse argument hypothesizes multiple dimensions. And it keeps, essentially, it's a way to just kind of keep making the math work so that you can come up with an answer to how we got here. The problem is, it's just a cheat code that doesn't hold up to the light of day. And when you look, you keep going on and you see more. You see irreducible complexity. And you can look at all kinds of things. Take blood clotting. It requires 20 proteins working in precise sequential chain. Remove any one of those, and you either bleed out or clot constantly. Each protein is useless without the others. It's irreducibly complex. And then there's the bacteria flagellum, which is a propeller-like device enabling bacteria to swim. It's got a rotor, it's got bushings, it's got a drive shaft. Remove one part of it, and the rotor doesn't work properly. And so back in the day, there was the argument that, well, you've got simple cell organisms, and they're very simple, and then they got more complex. When you actually look at the simple cell organisms, you realize that they're very complex already. And you can just keep going on. To look at DNA, you see that DNA is like a computer program, as Bill Gates said, but far, far more advanced than any software we've created. The human genome contains 3.5 billion letters. It would fill an entire library. Even simple organisms like E. coli bacterium are 4 million letters long. And you can just keep going on and on. We have the issue of irreducible complexity. And then there's the fossil record. The fossil record just gets in the way. Stephen Jay Gould is a evolutionary biologist and no Christian. And he says a species does not arise gradually, but by steady transformation of its ancestors. The argument runs into a problem. He says a species does not arrive gradually, but steady transformation of its ancestors. And then he said that it appears all at once and fully formed. And here's the problem that you run into when you look at this. What Stephen Jay Gould realizes is that we can't look at the evolutionary chain and find evidence for macroevolution. We've got lots and lots of microevolution. But macroevolution, they can't find the links. There's something that you call the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is just this point where life explodes, and there's all kinds of new things, and they have no evidence for anything being like built one on top of another. You don't have this chain and thread. And then ultimately, naturalism has a bigger picture. It can't answer the problems of life. It runs into the deeper problems of why do we think things are wrong in the world? It runs into the problem of saying, well, what you feel like is love is just a bunch of chemical signals going on. It's not real. It runs into the problem of morality. Where do you get moral laws? How do we account for justice? How do you say that abusing somebody is wrong? If we're all just dancing to our DNA, on what basis do you say something's wrong? And by the way, if we're all just dancing to our DNA, why do we find our own reasoning trustworthy? And at a certain point, you start to realize that the whole thing starts to tilt like the Titanic. And as you keep pressing on, you start to realize something else. There's limits of science as a way of knowing. Science can tell you how something happened, but it can't tell you why. John Pollinghorne, who teaches at Cambridge and is an Anglican physicist, or priest, along with being a physicist, said, imagine somebody asks, why is the water boiling in the kettle? One person answers, because burning gas is heating the water, which is a scientific explanation. Another person answers, because I want a cup of tea, which answers right. Both are right. One talks about non-personal causes and mechanistic forces, And that's what science does. The other talks in terms of a personal purpose and intention. It's not scientific in a mechanistic way, but it's true and terribly important. Science involves a method enormously useful for investigating large chunks of reality, but it is not the only way to know truth. Human life is of great value, you know that, but you cannot put it in a test tube, he says. You know, this is where we find ourselves stuck. You can answer something scientifically, but you can't understand other purposes. And beyond that, you run into the issue that when science says you can't show something scientifically, you've got another problem. What about the record of history that can't be bottled up in a science lab? Years ago, I read an article entitled, "Why Our Children Don't Think There Are Moral Facts." And the writer was a history professor. And he walked into his son's elementary school and he saw a sign. Facts, something that is true about a subject and can be tested and proven. Opinions, what someone thinks, feels, or believes. And he said, wait a minute, we can't scientifically prove history, but that doesn't invalidate it. You've all heard me say science can't tell me that Washington crossed the Delaware, but we all know it happened. Science has limits. Another thing to just note before we move on is that science has also gotten things badly wrong over the years. Eugenics was taught as settled science. Eugenics said some races were further along the evolutionary chain and therefore superior. That was settled science. That settled science gave us the Holocaust. Science has its own flaws. It's not inerrant. You know, and so at a certain point, we start to see there's all kinds of holes. The other thing to realize is that in the end, science itself is saying, I trust in science to understand how the world came to be is a leap of faith. In the end, you're essentially looking at a miracle. Either you've got a mathematical theorem problem, which is a giant miracle, or you've got a miracle of God created the heavens and the earth. But either way, it's a miracle. The question is, which miracle are you going to trust and believe in? At the end of the day, both are a miracle. You know, and sometimes people say, well, I can't see God, I can't test God. But look, you know, sometimes we think, well, I have to be able to test it to know. And sometimes you'll see people say, well, we went up into space and we couldn't find God. The problem is God exists outside of time and space. We would relate to God the way that Hamlet relates to Shakespeare, which is we can't come into contact with one another apart from God revealing himself. Science isn't going to be able to find that on its own, which is why we need more, which is why we need his revelation. And at the end of the day, science can tell us a lot. It can investigate. It can tell us how the world works in terms of the mechanisms, but it can't give us the bigger answers. It can't disprove God, and it can't give us the deepest answers that our heart is after. And because of that, we can say with confidence, at the end of the day, it's limited in what it can show us. Now, all of this brings us to a second issue. And that second issue is that this is God's world, and he invites us to study in it. And the real question underneath the debates is this: how do I obtain knowledge, reliable knowledge about the world? How do I get that? How do I find out how the world works? How do I understand things? Dr. Ard Lewis, who teaches in Oxford, says the big question of life is sometimes framed in science versus religion terms because people consider science to be a reliable way to obtain knowledge, and many think that other ways, including religious ones, are by contrast unreliable. And so he notes that this topic has been debated by the greatest minds in history, and in the end, nobody has won. The outcome is a stalemate. And yet, in the public discourse, he says, people operate as if science has won and they're blissfully unaware of the stalemate. All of that brings us back to Psalm 19. And what does David say there? He says that you can look at the world, you can study it, observe it, and see the patterns and organization, and see that it all points to God. We can see that the world is intelligible. It's the product of a rational mind. And therefore, we can study it. And this passage invites us to do that very thing, to look and behold what's communicated. And that brings us to a concept called intelligibility. God, that says that God made the world with order and precision. He's sovereign over his creation. And because of that, we can learn things about him. We can't learn everything, but we can learn some things about him. And here's the interesting thing to see. When we look at the development of science, you see something. It grew up in Christian soil. Now, I'm sure that there's a few of you that are now tilting your head. So let me walk you through the history. The history of science getting started is fascinating. It got started in a lot of places: Greece, Rome, Egypt, China, ancient Babylonian world, the Islamic world. But each time it ran into a wall. It hit a dead end everywhere. You see the Islamic Golden Age. It takes off. You've got advancements in mathematics, astronomy, optics, medicine, and yet it stalls. And the question is, why did it stall? Why did it stall in the Islamic tradition and China? Both, and here's the answer. In Christianity, nature is subordinate to God, who is rational, ordered, and self-revealing. And this is important because you can't build science on a whim. The Greeks had a capricious gods who would do something, who would do something sometimes, but not always, depending on their mood. And that left people deeply unstable. If you believe it rained today because the gods got angry, how do you develop a systematic explanation that doesn't involve the arbitrary whims of the gods? And so Christians said, look, we are not under the domain of capricious gods. The world is ordered in a certain way by God, and therefore we can study it. And Christianity broke through both the Greek and Islamic instability by insisting that the Creator is reason himself. Jesus is the Logos, the Word made flesh, and that his creation bears his rational signature. And when you stop and you look at this, you see that this theological explanation gave the foundation for the development of the scientific process as we understand it. And then it was all compounded by the doctrine of the fall that was regained in the Reformation. So what's fascinating is in the Reformation, they reclaimed the doctrine of the fall at a much deeper level. And then they said, wait a minute, if we're fallen, therefore we can't just observe and figure things out on our own. We need to do deeper study. And out of that theological understanding, they started developing processes to test and understand things. You've heard me say, doctrine is for life. Apart from doctrine, you don't have the development of science as a discipline, the robust discipline that we have. It was out of that. And look, it was deeply committed Christians that were doing a lot of that work. Isaac Newton wrote more on theology than he did on science, which is just fascinating to look at. Robert Boyle, the author of Boyle's Law, observed that God's creation operates according to fixed laws which he alone first established. And he's a believer. A lot of these guys that were at work in the beginning of the development of the scientific method were believers, and that continues to be true. When you look, you see, even now, you've got Christians in the sciences. When I was in seminary, I worked for the American Scientific Affiliation. And it was a group of believers who were Christians teaching at universities and other incredible places who were committed, faithful followers of Christ, trying to work in those fields as believers. When I was in my DMin, we went down to, as part of the Ockenga Fellowship, we went and met with Rosalind Picard, who teaches and works at MIT. She was deeply involved in creating wearable technologies. Anybody have one of these on their wrist? We can thank her groundbreaking work. She's a deeply committed believer. If you're wearing a smartwatch right now, you can thank the work of a committed believer. And you can look on and on. The reality is there's many Christians who are in the field. Stephen Jay Gould, who's not a Christian, observed either half of my colleagues are enormously stupid or else the science of Darwin is fully compatible with conventional religious beliefs and equally compatible with atheism. I think that might be an overstatement, but we need to see what his point is. If science hasn't disproved Christianity, if science has disproved Christianity, no one has thought to notify those who are involved in the sciences. Now, all of that brings us back to the elephant in the room, which is the argument that if you're an Orthodox Christian with a high view of the Bible, you cannot believe in evolution in any form. You have to believe in a young earth and 6 literal 24-hour days. That assumption is given by multiple people, including people like Ken Ham, who's who is a young earth creationist writer, and Richard Dawkins, the British evolutionary biologist. You know, these guys disagree on everything. And I mean everything, but they agree on this. They say that if you don't believe in 6 24-hour days, you can't be a Christian. Now here's the problem with this. There's a lot of people throughout church history who are committed and faithful followers of Christ who didn't read Genesis 1 as 6 full 24-hour days. They looked at it as a piece of understanding the genre, that it's a piece of poetry. That's the form of Genesis 1. Genesis 2 is hard history. And they didn't take a 6 24-hour view. And I mean, I'm not talking about the junior varsity. You can put Irenaeus, Augustine, B.B. Warfield, Charles Spurgeon, Herman Bavinck, J. Gresham Machen, John Stott, John Piper, James Boyce, Gordon Hugenberger, and pretty much all of the faculty at Gordon Conwell on this list. Augustine said what kind of days these were is extremely difficult or perhaps impossible to determine. Irenaeus took the view that said 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years, and said it can be read as longer. And the church fathers didn't all uniformly read the days as 6 24-hour periods. Charles Spurgeon said, "We do not know how remote the period of creation of this globe, certainly many millions of years before the time of Adam." James Boyce, the driving voice behind the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy with R.C. Sproul, said, "In my judgment, the earth is billions of years old." Now, I want to be clear. I have a debate with the Roman Catholic Church on many, many subjects, but interestingly, they say they do not insist on young earth creationism as a doctrinal requirement. They've consistently held that Genesis is not a science textbook, and they've been formally open to the possibility that God worked through natural processes over vast periods of time. And so all that is to say, while I have deep arguments with the Catholic Church, I have really serious agreements with people like Spurgeon and Boyce, and my main point here is that not everybody is on the same page as this. Not everybody's going to agree with Dawkins and say, if you can't hold 6 24 hours, you're out. The other thing I'd want to just point out is when you start to look at this, you run into some problems. When you look at Genesis 1, you start to see something. The conclusion that the earth is 6,000 years old is reached by a chain of assumptions. The creation week of Genesis, the first assumption is each day is a 24-hour period of time. The second is that old earth geology naturally entails macroevolution and animal death before the fall, and therefore they say, well, you can't have death before the fall, therefore that can't be. And that the earth's age can be reconstructed backwards from geological time markers in Genesis. Now, these points may all be true. They may not be. But it's important to just see that the assumption of how old is the earth and how did that process work out is deduced from assumptions not directly answered in Scripture. And now I'm just going to push back on that a little bit and give you some textual reasons that scholars bring up to say we could doubt the 6:24 reading. First, Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is looking at this as a background statement describing how the universe came to be. In the Hebrew, the word created is in the perfect tense. And when a perfect verb begins a Hebrew narrative unit, it describes an event that precedes the main storyline. Heavens and earth is a merism, indicating totality. Beyond that, when you look, you see the earth, darkness, and water exist before the first day. Furthermore, when you keep going, you see that the seventh day is not 24 hours long. On the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, we're told in Genesis 2:2-3. And he rested on the seventh day from his work. And when you look on, the question is, was God's creation rest limited to a 24-hour period? No. Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4 teach that God's Sabbath rest remains, and that we can enter into it or be prevented from entering into it. And so if the seventh day is still in progress, the ongoing divine Sabbath, then our weekly observance is analogical, first of all. But second of all, if we're still in that seventh day, it makes it harder to argue that all the other days were 24 hours. And we can just press on. When you turn into Genesis 2 and you get to 5 and onward, you see that the genre changes. Genesis 1 up to 2:4 is Hebrew poetry. Genesis 2:5 and onward changes the structure, and now you move into historical narrative, which is important to note because when you get to that, you have to ask, okay, so what's going on? And what's going on is that you see in Scripture again and again a process or a place where you'll see two things, an event told in two ways. They sing about it, there's a piece of poetry, and there's a piece of historical narrative. And you get this in several places. You see this in when you look at the account of the victory in Judges 4 and 5. You see the historical narrative, and you see the victory sung about. You see this in the account of the Exodus. They sing about the Exodus after you get the historical accounting of it. So you get several places in Scripture where you get two tellings of something because it's incredibly important. And so you get the hard historical version and the version that includes the singing and the poetry, and the details might be slightly different, but they're not in conflict because one's giving you the bigger theological point. And all of that brings us to just stopping and going, okay, we can hold this with humility. The other thing to notice is when you look at Genesis 1, it's a piece of poetry where day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, and day 3 and day 6 correspond. And so you have light and darkness created in day 1, and then day and 4, that domain is filled up with the sun, moon, and stars. Day 2, you have the sea and the sky created, and then you have the fish and the birds. And then day 3, you have land, and then in day 6, you have animals and man. And the thing to understand that what's going on in the background is that God is giving a polemic in Genesis 1. And the polemic is against the beliefs of the ancient world that said that the world was created out of God's warring and chaos and battles and fighting. And so in the Enuma Elish, you have all these gods in battle with each other, and then they take the carcass of a dead god, Tiamat, and they make the world out of it. And the Genesis says, in Genesis 1, says in contrast to that, no, God made the world. He made it with order. He made it with focus. He made it with control. He and he alone is sovereign over all things. The world didn't come out of chaos. God made it with order and precision. And so here's the thing I would say, because I look around this room, I've got some people here who hold a 624 view. I have some members of this church that hold a framework view. I have members of the church that hold a variety of different views on it. Some of you may hold the gap view, although I've never spoken with you about that. There are non-negotiables, and then there's things we can argue about. The non-negotiables is that God is the creator of everything, that there is only one God, that he is sovereign over everything, and the universe did not create itself and did not appear by chance, and the world reflects its creator. God is the lawgiver. Beyond that, humans are the bearers of God's image, and that Adam was created directly by the hand of God. Genesis 2 is hard history. So even if you hold a view that says God made the world through a process, the thing you have to understand and know is that Genesis 2 says God made Adam as special creation. He was made by the direct hand of God, and that's not a piece of poetry. That is historical narrative. And so there's a range of positions that somebody who holds those views can take, whether you take the gap theory or the historical creation view, which says that Genesis 1 is really about the creation of the garden. That's a view that Piper holds. You could take the day-age view. Each day corresponds to a long epic. You can take the framework view, which is the view that Mike Horton and Gordon Hugenberger and many of the professors at Gordon Conwell held, which sees Genesis 1 as a literary framework. You could take the young earth view, but you have to hold these things. And I would say this is a secondary issue ultimately, so long as you affirm that God is the sovereign creator. But in the end, my point is simple. The assertion that science disproves God is deeply flawed. One of the things you run into is if you take the framework view and you have a science teacher look at you as a student and say, you Christians don't believe in science. You can look at him and point out Genesis 1 is a piece of poetry that does things that poetry does, like having parallel. And the issue is not that we Christians don't know how to do science, it's that you don't know how to read your Bible. At the end of the day, you cannot shake the fact that this came from the hand of God. The whole argument is flawed. Science can't give you the answers. The scientific method was created by Christians. At the end of the day, there's flawed assumptions underneath this argument that says science and faith are in conflict. It just can't do the work it intends to. This whole argument breaks down. Now we need to hit some questions very briefly. And the first one is, what about miracles? The argument against miracles breaks down at this level. People say, well, you can't break the laws of nature. Here's the thing. If God is sovereign, there can be times where he does break the law of nature, where he, having ordered the world, can still step in and reach in and say, I'm going to do X. There's an old story about a kid who goes off to college and he comes home and he says to his dad, I can't believe in God because, there's the story of Jonah and a great fish or a whale or something comes and he gets swallowed by the whale, and we know that can't happen. And the father looks at the son and says, the issue isn't found in the issue of the whale. The issue is found in Jonah's God. Is God sovereign and able to do what he wills? Another question that will pop up is, well, what about those times where it seems like science contradicts the Bible when you see things like, the smallest seed? Well, look, they're speaking about in their situation. The smallest seed conversation is tied to the fact that Jesus is talking about the smallest seed that they used for planting gardens. And you have to look at the context. To look in the Bible is to see all kinds of things, including the affirmation that the world is round. Sometimes people try to say, well, science told us that the world is round. Actually, the Bible did long before. You just have to go back and study it out. And look, one of the other things you're going to say is, well, Pastor, you didn't tell me which view you hold. I didn't for a reason. At the end of the day, I want people in this church to show grace to one another on this subject. It's a secondary issue. If you hold the core issue that God is the sovereign creator, that Adam is truly a historical figure, which the Bible affirms again and again, I'm going to show grace to this room. Because as a pastor, I just look back on my own career. When I grew up in six 24-hour view parents who, my mom schooled me on creation science. Then I went to Cornerstone, a really conservative Christian college, and I got a second view from John Salhamer and the work that he had done. The view that said that the 6 24-hour days are about the creation of the garden. This is a super conservative Christian school, giving me a secondary view. Then I went to seminary, and I started working at the American Scientific Affiliation my first year in seminary. And here's all these Christians that hold intelligent design and are faithfully following Christ. Then Gordon Conwell taught the framework hypothesis. And at a certain point, what I've had to say is, I've seen Christians who love the Lord that don't hold 624, and I'm just not willing to run everybody else out of the room. We're going to show grace to those who look at it and say, it's a piece of poetry, and I interpret it differently than 6 24-hour days. And so I didn't give the answer. But here's what I will say before we wrap up. We've kind of walked through the different options, and we've talked through the other things, but at the end of the day, we need to see this. Having knocked away the science argument, the view that Science disproves God. We've taken that apart from different angles. But the last thing I want you to see is that science can't deal with the fact that creation declares the glory of God. You know, when I was in Texas, one of the things I'd do is go out at night and look at the giant Texas sky. And the sky really is bigger in Texas. It's flat. It just goes on forever. And you go out here and there's hills. The sky runs into the hill that Witch Meadow Road goes up. But the sky goes on forever, and you just sit there and you look up. You know, when it's dark at night, and we were far enough out in the country that you didn't have ambient light everywhere, and you just realize that there is a God, that this couldn't just happen. There's times here, we get great sunsets in Salem. There's times where Veronique grabs me and says, look. She has to stop me because I'm probably in motion doing something. And she slows me down and she says, stop and look. What do we look at? What are we looking at when we look at the sunset? Are we saying, well, that's a chemical reaction that's happening because the earth rotates? That's not what we do. We look at it and we go, that's a beautiful thing created by God. We say, O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider the worlds thy hands have made. To look at the world is to be led to worship. It's to look around and say, God is the one who has put all this together. But here's the thing to see. At the end of the day, while creation leads us to the fact that there is a God, it can't take you to the end. That's where you need the Word. And when you look at the Word, what you see is that the heavens declare the glory of God, and then you look in the Word and you see that God. And you see more than that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God wrote himself into the story in the person of Jesus Christ. You know, there's one of the things that the people who study the works of Dorothy Sayers say is that she wrote herself into the story. Years ago, she wrote this series called the Peter Wimsey Detective Novels, and it's got this aristocrat who's upper crust, very vulnerable, super smart, he solves mysteries, and then partway through the series, there's this character put in, Harriet Vane. She's the first woman to graduate Oxford. She writes detective novels. On and on it goes, and then when you look at her, you see what happened. She looked at this character and she said, she saw how lonely he was, and she wrote herself into the world. She incarnated herself. And in the story, she marries him and sort of saves him. And that's touching, but the gospel does one better. It tells us that the one who made the world didn't just look at us and love us and care for us. He came into the world and died for us to redeem us. And if we trust him, we will be saved by him. And he proves it by rising from the dead. You know, when science squawks, no miracles, evolution disproves God. The problem is Jesus Christ blew the doors off the tomb. And history recounts that. And there goes the argument. And someday he is coming back, and therefore we can trust him. Because science can't tell you everything. It can tell you a lot of things, but in the end, you've still got to look at what are the other means of knowing, and the historical record is one. And when we look at the record of history, we see that Jesus Christ blew the doors off the tomb. And someday, if we trust him, we will be with him forever. He will come back and put the world right. And so the heavens declare the glory of God. They tell us this. They tell us there is a God who made us. And then ultimately they tell us that we need to look deeper. And they take us to the Word, the sure Word that we see following up from the heavens declare the glory of God. And in the end, that is our answer. When we look at the question of can science disprove God, we run into the person and work of Jesus Christ, who did what science says can't happen. He rose. Now, all of this brings us to some conclusions. How do we end? How do we respond to this? The first one is, if you're not a Christian, I would say put your hope in Jesus Christ. Put your faith in Jesus Christ. Everybody is standing on something that they trust in. The person who trusts in science is standing on a foundation. The Christian is standing on a foundation. Sometimes science, people who believe it, like put their hope in science, say, you have faith and I don't. No, you just have faith in a different object. Put your trust in Jesus Christ. The second thing I would say as we wrap up is know that science can't lay a finger on God. If you're a Christian getting hammered on this question, If you're running into it, know that it can't deal with the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning teleological argument, the reality of morality, the fact of consciousness, and so much more. God is not threatened by science. The third thing I say is show grace to those who hold a different position on creation. In this room, there's different people who have different views. In the church, no matter where you go, you're going to run into people who have different views. The reality is that Genesis 1 was given to say to the world that said all the gods were fighting and the world was chaotic, that God made the world and ordered it, and we can trust him. And so I would say speak with grace to one another. But then I would say go outside and look up and know that the heavens declare the glory of God. And then beyond that, proclaim the gospel boldly. You know, for the skeptic, your first move can be to take them outside and look up and say, look around. Do you think this happened by luck and chance? Look at this. Tell me it just happened. The heavens declare the glory of God. And then rejoice in the fact that they do. Rejoice in the fact that heaven declares his glory. That God made the world and we can see his hand on it. Rejoice in that. Let's pray.